Helping me out with the questions, and he is with us on the polar bear trip. So, should we just get started with the questions?
Yeah.
So, what do polar bears eat? Mainly, probably seals, right?
That's right.
Basically seals.
Polar bears eat mostly two species of seals, either ringed seals or bearded seals, and they catch them out on the surface of the sea ice, where the seal swims around underneath the ice and has to come up for air because they're air-breathing animals just like people are. And when they come up for air, there might be a polar bear waiting for them on top. And I think I can give you an example of how this works. So Gavin, why don't you stand over there beside your chair for a minute? Okay, and now I want you to kneel down, and I want you to bring your head right up above the level. Slowly, start out here. Now bring your head right up above the level of the table. So how was that, Gavin? Did you like that?
It wouldn't be funny for a seal, let's just say.
That's right. It wouldn't be.
No. So, second question, how much do they eat?
Polar bears eat as many seals as they can catch. If you're a polar bear, the best thing you can do is to get really big, and the best way to do that is to eat a lot of seals. But on average, it looks like polar bears catch about 1 seal a week. And so a lot of the time they'll eat a big meal, it'll fill their stomach, and then for maybe several days they don't eat much.
So how do they hunt? Well, really gather food type thing.
There's about 3 major techniques that polar bears use for hunting seals. One is the one that we just showed you, where a seal comes up through a breathing hole and the bear is waiting there, and when the seal's head shows up, and that's it. The other is that, or one of the other ones is that in the spring of the year, ring seals make these little caves that are underneath the surface of the snow but above the ice, and that's where they give birth to their pups. And polar bears can sniff out those little caves, and they break in and remove the occupants, but the end is the same. And then a lot of times you'll see bears just stalking around on the ice looking for seals, and if they see one, they might make a mad dash to catch it. So
tell them this is the bear right beside.
Oh, and that, yeah.
Oh yeah, all of these bears that you're seeing, they're all live right outside our Tundra Buggy. So, next question. Why do polar bears play, fight, all that stuff?
Yeah, and remember we saw those bears play fighting yesterday. What we see up here on the coast of Hudson Bay in the fall is oftentimes we'll see male bears kind of clashing with each other. They're boxing, they're sparring, sometimes they even look like they're dancing. And what we think that is that they're kind of training themselves for real fights that they might have in the spring of the year during the breeding season, when male bears are fighting in competition over females. And they can learn fighting techniques, and they can learn who's the toughest bear on the block. And in the spring, they might say, well, I'd like to chase after that female bear over there, but I know that guy's tougher than me, so I'm not going to.
How much do polar bears sleep?
Polar bears sleep a variable amount. Most of the bears that are here on the land, when they're waiting for the ice to come in, there's nothing really here for them to eat. So they spend most of their time resting. And they might be spending 98% of their time resting and only 2% or so walking around. But whether or not it's 98 and 2 or some other proportion, this time of year, they're mostly spending their time resting. When they're out on the sea ice, they spend a much higher proportion of their time, 20, 30, 40, maybe even sometimes 50% of their time actually hunting. But some of that hunting is still hunting, where they're just waiting at a breathing hole. And so that looks like rest too.
So how much do polar bears sleep?
Well, they sleep whenever they're not active. And so here, that might be a big part of that most of the time that they're here. One of the things that's interesting is that they seem to be mostly active during the daylight hours. Some people think, oh, bears are usually active at night, but polar bears have very good eyesight, and a lot of their hunting is done by vision as well as by their really incredible sense of smell. And they can see more in the daytime than they can at night, just like we can.
So what is the temperature during the day in Manitoba and at night?
Well, the temperature depends a lot on what time of year it is. In the summertime here on Hudson Bay, where we are now, it might get up to 60, 70, maybe even 80 degrees sometimes in the summer. So it can be quite warm, but in the wintertime, it can be minus 40 degrees below zero, or even colder. So it depends. And of course, it's a little bit warmer during the day than it is at night, just like every place. And in fact, here, the day-night fluctuations in the wintertime especially can be much greater because there's very little humidity in the air. And so there isn't much holding the heat near the ground when the sunlight goes away. It escapes into space, and so you can have really cold nights.
So how much snow falls in Manitoba at a time?
Manitoba can get a lot of snowfall. In the hills and in the forested areas near here, near where we are now, sometimes the snow is many feet deep. So deep and fluffy that you can't even drive a snow machine over the top of it because you just sink in. It can be really difficult. But out here, if you look, you see that there's not much snow right now. And even later in the winter, it might not look a whole lot different because there's so much wind out here on the coast that it blows a lot of that snow right up into the trees, right far, miles away. And so the snow depth out here is never very great.
So how do polar bears stay warm?
Polar bears have two really good things that help them stay warm. They have that white coat with a really long fur, and then a smaller, a shorter fur underneath, an underfur that's really soft and fuzzy. And that gives them really good protection from cold air. But underneath their fur and underneath their skin is a big layer of fat. And that fat layer keeps them warm when they're in the water. Hair gets wet and compresses and doesn't give them much insulation when they're in the water, but that fat layer does. So they've got those two really important tools to keep themselves warm.
So how can the bears get in and out of the water and not suffer from the cold?
Well, when they're in the water, the fat keeps them warm. And then when they get out of the water and their hair is all wet, they can shake off just like a dog. You've all seen your dog get into the pond or get into the stream, and it gets out and it shakes and it makes a big mess in the house. Well, polar bears do the same thing, and their hair has a lot of oil in it, so they can shed the water very quickly.
How many polar bears live in this area right now?
The estimated population in western Hudson Bay is about 700 to maybe 800 animals. And that's down quite a bit from what it was about 20 years ago. 20 years ago, we estimated that there were over 1,200 animals here. So the population's been gradually declining. Worldwide, there's about 20,000 polar bears, and they live in 19 different populations all around the top of the world. If you take a globe in your classroom and you look at the top, you're looking at polar bear habitat.
So how big, height, weight do they get?
Polar bears are the largest of all the bears, and a big adult male can weigh 1,200 pounds or more. When they're walking on all fours, they can be nearly 5 feet high at the shoulder. So taller than you at the shoulder when they're walking on all fours. And when they stand up on their hind legs, they can reach a basketball hoop.
So what plants grow in the Arctic tundra?
Well, if you look around here, and we can see from the pictures where we've been watching these bears, there's these low willow bushes, and some of those are actually a shrub birch. You might have birch trees some places in Texas. These are birch bushes. Most of the things here in the tundra are very low lying. They grow very close to the ground. Why do you think that is?
Might be because some of the bears need to get to them to do like maybe mating and giving birth, maybe?
Well, I don't think they give birth out here, but they might mate out here. And we've seen some of them scratch their bellies, right?
Yes.
Yeah, but I don't think it's the scratching of the bellies that keeps the plants small here. What keeps the plants small is the wind. It's so windy that these bushes just can't grow much height because they'd be blowing around like this and breaking off in the wind. You remember those Dr. Seuss looking spruce trees we were talking about yesterday? If you looked at some of them, all the branches are on one side. That's because the wind was coming from the other side and breaking off all those branches. We call those flag trees.
So what other animals live in this area right now?
There's quite a few other animals that live here. There's caribou. We haven't seen any caribou, but they do live around here. There's moose. There's wolves. There's foxes. We saw an Arctic fox yesterday. Remember that? It wasn't much bigger than this bear's head. And there are Arctic hares. These are giant rabbits that are as big as that fox. And there's ptarmigan. Ptarmigan are a kind of a grouse that is really small, and they're about this big, and this time of year they're just completely white. So the only time you can see them is when they take off and fly, and they open up their tail feathers a little bit, and there's a couple of dark feathers.
So are polar bears hunted by any other animals in this area?
The main hunter of polar bears is man. But polar bear cubs sometimes fall victim to hunting by wolves. One wolf probably couldn't catch a polar bear cub because the mother bear could protect it, but wolves hunt in packs, and they're really efficient hunters, and they can surround a mother bear and get her confused, and sometimes they can catch the cubs. Around here, that's really about the only other thing that's a threat to polar bears.
Do polar bears travel alone?
Most of the time, polar bears are what we call solitary. That is, they travel as individuals and don't normally interact with other bears. The exceptions to that are family groups. Mother polar bears keep their cubs with them for 2 1/3 years. So that means that they can only have a new set of cubs every 3 years. The other time we see bears grouped together is like right around here in Hudson Bay, where they're basically just waiting for the sea ice to freeze. They all want to be in the same place at the same time because this is where the first ice will show up in the fall. And so they tolerate each other being close together. And in fact, it looks like some of them enjoy each other's company while they're here. Most of the time when they're out on the sea ice, they're just walking around by themselves.
So how many cubs do polar bears have?
Polar bears most commonly have 2 cubs. Sometimes, very rarely, they have 3 cubs. And more often than 3, they have 1 cub. So the average size is about 1.7 cubs, but we know there's no such thing as 0.7 cub, right? So that's an average.
So how long does a cub stay with her mother?
Polar bears breed in the spring and they give birth in the winter, and the cubs come out of the den with the mother in the spring of the year, and they will stay with that mother through the first summer, the first winter, all the way around through the second winter, and then they'll separate from the mother when they're about 2 1/3 years of age. And then the mother can breed again and have another set of cubs.
So I kind of know this answer already. Are polar bears mean?
Are polar bears mean? I don't think polar bears are mean. In fact, I think that polar bears are relatively mild-mannered when it comes to bears. Grizzly bears, I think, are kind of ornery. Polar bears, by comparison, are relatively mild-mannered. Now, that doesn't mean that if we walked around out here that they wouldn't attack us and probably eat us, because they would. They're hungry. But that doesn't necessarily mean they're mean. It just means that they're hungry, and we're about the size of the things that they normally eat.
How do they swim?
Polar bears swim basically like your dog swims. You know, it's what we would call a dog paddle, but they're a little bit more adept at swimming than your dog are. They do use their hind legs, not only for paddling, but for changing direction. And when they swim underwater especially, they use all four. And sometimes polar bears will dive very deep down to the bottom to look for something to eat. So maybe clams or kelp or something like that. Most of the things they get down there aren't very nutritious for them, but they still explore. And polar bears really are quite good swimmers.
Can they breathe underwater?
Polar bears cannot breathe underwater. They're just like you and me. We have to breathe air. They can hold their breath for about 3 minutes, but they can't breathe down there.
How long do polar bears live?
The longest living polar bear was a polar bear in the Winnipeg Zoo that lived for 42 years. And bears in zoos often live quite a lot longer than they do in the wild. Why do you think that might be?
Hunting, maybe trying to adapt.
Yeah, well, those are good reasons. But look out here and where these bears are living, and where do you think it might be easiest living? In a zoo where people bring you food every day, or out here where you got to find your food and you got to go for months without food?
Zoo.
Yeah, polar bears have a much easier life in a zoo. They get good care in most zoos, and so often they live much longer. In the wild, the oldest polar bears we've experienced in the wild are about 30 years old, and most of them only live into their mid-20s.
So are they considered fast or slow?
Well, I guess it depends if you're on the ground trying to run away from them. Polar bears can outrun any human, and for a short distance at least you would never have a chance. But compared to a cheetah, they're slow. A polar bear can maybe run about 30 miles an hour. The cheetah can run close to 70 miles an hour, but you can only run about 15 miles an hour.
So that was the last of the questions, and any extra questions that you just thought of?
Some questions from the class?
Cameron has a question. Cameron, what's your question?
How many layers of coats do you have to wear?
Gavin, how many coats are you having to wear to stay warm?
What would you say?
Was the question how many cubs we've seen since you've been here?
Yeah.
We saw,
You're kind of.
I think only 2.
2.
All right, Calista.
Are babies or cubs born with fur?
Are the cubs born with fur?
Yeah, they are, right?
A little bit.
Yeah.
Polar bear cubs are born about this big, and they're blind, and they do have just a little bit of fur. It's almost like a suede shoe, and but they're totally helpless. They can kind of crawl around, and all they do is live in the den with their mother and drink their mother's milk until the time that they come out of the den. And that's when they look like what we think of as baby bears, and they're about this big, and they actually look like bears. When they're first born, they look more like rats.
Gavin, can you see the bear that's right behind you guys?
Oh, yeah.
Katie.
Has it changed the color? Do polar bears change colors as they get older?
Do polar bears change colors as they get older?
Polar bears don't necessarily change color as they get older, but each year they molt. Just like if any of you have a pet dog or a cat, it sheds its fur. Polar bears do the same thing, and they usually start their molt in the spring of the year, and by the fall they have a brand new clean white shiny coat, and that coat is its whitest and its shiniest then. By the next spring, when they start to grow another fresh coat of hair. That coat might be quite dirty. It will have absorbed oils from the prey that the bears have killed. It will have absorbed contaminants from the ocean. And so then they kind of look kind of a little bit yellowish. But that's about the only changes you see. Older polar bears have the same color fur as younger polar bears.
Okay, and we're going to do one more, and then we're going to let Gavin talk to you. How big is the cub compared to the mother?
The cub, when a polar bear is born, it's a small fraction of the mother's weight. A mother bear that weighs 500 or 600 pounds will give birth to a couple of cubs that weigh about 1.5 pounds each.
Wow.
So the only animals that have smaller young are what we call marsupials, like kangaroos and opossums, things like that. They have very, very tiny undeveloped young, but polar bears have the smallest young for the size of their mother of any of the what we call placental mammals, the more modern mammals.
Gavin, is there anything that's really awesome that you've done or seen that you want to tell us about?
Well, we just saw an Arctic fox last night, which is awesome. They look really funny and cute. It's really fun, just fun to see them. And it's also really hard to see them. And it's also really hard to see polar bears. And we haven't seen a snowshoe hare yet. I really want to see one. But a few times you could get, we got woken up in the night by a polar bear just climbing on the vehicle or stomping outside or something like that. So it's really fun to just see polar bears in the wild, not in like zoos where they're all trapped and they don't have the right habitat or anything. So
I hear you have a pretty big adventure ahead of you. Maybe this afternoon or tomorrow you would.
yeah.
What do you know?
Big.
Are you doing dog sledding later?
We are?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, yes.
Oh, I hope I didn't ruin any surprise. Okay, well, we should probably let you guys go, but thank you so much, and we hope you're having a great time. Tell your staff there, thank you for helping us out. And everybody wave at Gavin.
Bye.
I'm glad we got in touch with you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.